Hi, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you can see me okay and hear me okay. I'm delighted to be introducing the next section of the webinar. So I just wanted to mention before we move on to our next panelist, who's the brilliant Charlie Ball, that we have got some fantastic questions so far on Q&A. So in the Q&A section, we've had some brilliant questions from that first section about things like influencing people within the organization, some resistance that may have been kind of experienced in terms of introducing careers type peer approaches, and funding questions as well. So to let you know, because a lot of those questions were directed at specific panelists and different individuals within the panels this morning. What we're going to do is collate those questions and circulate them afterwards with some responses, because we don't have quite enough time this morning to fit everything in. So instead, we're going to circulate those questions and make sure that we get responses. So next on the agenda, we have the ever brilliant Dr. Charlie Ball. So Charlie, as you are sharing your camera and your microphone and your slides, if you want to start slide sharing for us, Charlie. Hello.
Hola, how are we doing?
I'm very good, thank you. Great for you to join us. Many of you will know our wonderful friend Charlie, and he is here to deliver his next session for us, which is all about the 5 myths of the UK graduate labour market. Charlie, I've already let you know, I'm here to make sure we finish on time. So if I start butting in towards the end, you know what I'm doing.
I would never just go on and on and on without. That's completely and absolutely unlike me.
Wonderful. Well, over to you, Charlie. Thank you so much.
Right. Good morning, everybody. I am, as advertised, Charlie Ball. I cannot promise to be brilliant or ever wonderful or whatever it is that Rebecca just said. Very kind. I'm in a small cupboard in the Peak District, as you can see. And I'm going to be talking to you about some myths about the graduate labour market. This is an intensely serious session. All data in here is absolutely as accurate as I can make it and as up to date as we can. For those of you who've seen any of my sessions about myths about the graduate labour market, you'll notice that they are slightly different now because COVID. Don't know if you've noticed, but COVID's changed quite a lot of stuff. And in particular, some of the regional things that I would normally talk about may have gone out of the window, but we can maybe talk about that at the end, in the very likely event that I don't go on till take up my maximum allocation of time. So let's kick off. There are lots of myths around about the university and the graduate jobs market. Here you can see one of Ireland's leading academics, Professor Dougal Maguire, with a list of things that of myths, obviously demonstrating it to a skeptical audience. There are a lot of things that people believe about the graduate employment market and graduates and graduate jobs and so forth that are not necessarily actually true. Some of them affect student behaviour, some of them affect university behaviour, some of them affect government behaviour. All of them have got a grounding in some form of fact, but by and large, the things that people believe about them, or things that people say, and particularly things that you read in the media about them, are not necessarily correct. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lead you by the hand through 5 of the main ones, and 5 ones that are quite current that you hear quite a bit at the moment, and explain to you where they're right and where they're wrong. So the first is the idea is that degrees are ubiquitous. Everybody has a degree nowadays, of course. You hear that quite a bit. Degrees are so common, it's actually the norm for people to go to university these days. And if you don't go, you're quite unusual and a bit of an iconoclast, you know, a bit of an outlier, a bit of a rebel. It ain't true. As of the end of 2019, about 40% of the adult population had a degree or equivalent. And we're saying degree or equivalent is, this is formal post-18 education. So we are including things like degree apprenticeships. We're including HNDs and foundation degrees in here. So about 40% of the adult population had a degree at the end of 2019. It was up from, it had gone up about 1 percentage point. It was up from 39.2%. Younger people are more likely to be qualified. But still having a formal post-18 qualification is still a minority sport in the UK. Graduates are a large proportion of the population, but still there's a lot more people who haven't been to university and never will. However, about 45% of the workforce has a degree or equivalent, which is up from 44.4% the year before. This is because you're far more likely to have a job. This is something you don't read very often or hear very often from media narratives, but you're actually far more likely to have a job, far more likely to be in employment if you've got formal education, formal post-18 education, than if you haven't. It might seem obvious, but you would think from the narratives that have come out, particularly this year, that this wasn't actually the case. One of the interesting effects of one of the interesting and slightly depressing effects of pandemic, to be honest, when you consider the social and economic condition in the country right now, is that it is likely to increase the proportion of the workforce with a degree, simply because most of the people who've been worst affected by pandemic, and most of the sectors, with one exception, the arts, most of the sectors most affected by pandemic are largely employees of non-graduates. And most of the sectors that have fared reasonably well or seen an upturn in employment are graduates. So we're going to see more graduates as a proportion of the workforce in the future. And this is something that's really important to bear in mind, and we'll get onto some of the implications and some of the actual practical effects of believing or not really thinking about these myths very carefully when I come to the next slide, because actually we saw a very practical demonstration of what happens when people don't think clearly about the data and the context that they're in this year in the higher education sector. But the upshot is that less than half of students currently aged 14 to 18 will ever go to university. It's unlikely we'll ever see a situation where half of a given age group goes to university. Some of you might have seen earlier in the year some stories about the higher education participation rate, which went over 50% for the first time this year. And it was trailed, and a lot of people said that this meant that more than 50% of young people going to university, but it's not actually true. It means the likelihood of an average young person to go to university at some point during their lifetime had gone over 50%. And the reason for that is because if you've been to university, or if you're in one of the groups likely to go to university, you are almost certain to go to university. So, for example, over 95% of young people who have two parents who are graduates will go to university. And this is an extremely socially segregated set of people. The reason why you read newspaper and policy people saying, oh, everybody goes to university nowadays, is because everybody they know does go to university. Everybody like them goes to university. Middle class people go to university. But the majority of people around the country don't. And when you look at the situation for different towns, so if you look at St Albans, for example, about 80 to 85% of the population of St Albans has been to university. And the likelihood of somebody from going to, from a young person from St Albans going on to university is closing on 90%. My father comes from St Helens in the northwest, in Merseyside. About 20% of the workforce in St Helens have been to university. And not very many people from St Helens go to university now. And this simply reflects, this myth simply reflects that far more of our opinion formers and media people and policy people come from St Albans than from St Helens. And so everybody like them goes to university. Everybody they know, they went to university, their parents went to university, their kids went to university, their co-workers all went to university. They think they're normal, but they aren't. Most people haven't been to university. Most people are like my dad, who was from St Helens and didn't go to university. And that's one of the things that we lose sight of sometimes in the university sector. Similarly, there's this idea that there aren't any jobs for graduates, particularly at the moment. Now, if you look at the old Delhi data, I don't actually have or haven't been able to analyse graduate outcomes data because I only got my graduate outcomes data sets this week. And I've been busy writing presentations for keynote presentations for conferences. But we know that from 2017, pretty much on graduation, about 136,000 UK graduates were known to be in professional level jobs. It's a lot of people in graduate employment. If you look at annual population survey data, you can see that over 15 million people are working in professional level jobs. Those are the jobs that are considered graduate, and in fact, in the metrics, are considered graduate. Now, there's not a complete overlap between these jobs and those that require a degree. but about 80 to 85% overlap. The two biggest groups, the two biggest areas where the idea of professional level job and graduate job don't overlap terribly well are in shopkeepers, which are currently counted as a professional level job, but you don't need a graduate, you don't need a degree to do them. But as of 2020, those roles will no longer be counted as professional level. And in various forms of social and educational assistant work and health assistant work, where you do need a degree, but they are not counted as graduate level jobs. And again, come 2020, those jobs will be counted as graduate level. They about cancel one another out. In fact, there's probably slightly more people who should be counted as graduate who are not than there are people counted as graduate when they shouldn't be. So around 15 million people have degree level qualifications or are in degree level jobs. About 47% of the workforce. Now, if you think back to the last slide, you'll notice that actually that's a large proportion of the workforce that actually have degrees in the first place. That's interesting. Why is that? Well, there's three reasons. Firstly, as we've mentioned, complete match between occupations. The second reason is a lot of these jobs have changed quite considerably over an average working lifetime. The year is 2020. It's still 2020. It might felt like it's been 2020 for several thousand years because this has been a long 6 months. But the year is 2020. So people retiring this year at the age of 65 will have likely started work at the beginning of the 80s or early 70s or in the middle of the 70s. So you're seeing a lot of people most of whose working lives predated the internet retiring. The internet was a huge disruptor. I mean, people worry about the effect of AI on jobs. The honest thing is, people are saying all the things about AI that they would have said about the internet had they seen it coming. AI will have to be tremendously disruptive to be more disruptive than the internet was to people's lifetime. So the average working lifetime is a very long period of time, particularly at a rate of rapid technological changes, and a lot of jobs have changed very profoundly. Particularly, a lot of jobs have changed to require more technology or a broader range of skills, or just become more complicated. And so there are a lot of people leaving the workforce or in the late stages of their careers who are doing jobs that these days they would not be able to get with the level of qualifications that they've got. And the third reason why we seem to have more graduate level jobs than we have graduates is because in quite a lot of areas we don't have enough graduates, particularly in tech and IT and business services. It's not just in STEM, although STEM is quite important, particularly engineering right now. There are quite a lot of roles there that's where we don't have enough graduates to fill demand. What there isn't very much evidence that we've got too many graduates at all. The evidence for that is actually very weak. I'm going to get on to exactly why that is shortly. Annual population survey data shows that the UK added over 500,000 new professional level jobs. Created 500,000 new professional level jobs in 2019. So in other words, it created enough professional level jobs to absorb every single graduate in the UK from all levels. All of them. All of them could have got from new professional level jobs. In fact, what actually happened, of course, is a lot of people stayed on in education or didn't go into the workforce or went travelling or whatever. And so businesses had to fill those roles either with people who are not qualified, not strictly speaking qualified for them, or with overseas nationals. And we're going to see continued skill shortages. Graduate level positions have been mostly far more resilient to the pandemic than non-graduates. Now, of course, we have seen a lot fewer, there are a lot fewer graduate jobs. Currently, the vacancy rates this year is higher in graduate level positions, apart from, as I said, in the arts and creative industries. But still, the graduate labour market is not where it should be. But it's not vanished by any stretch of the imagination. It's still emphatically there. There are still jobs available for graduates, and graduates have fared rather better than non-graduates. One of the interesting effects of people failing to really grasp this particular issue is a lot of rhetoric earlier in the year that students would not apply to university this year. So we heard, particularly in April, May, a lot of concern that we wouldn't see applicants this year because people would defer. This instantly raised my alarm bells as a labour market specialist, because the assumption was going to be because people are making the assumption that the 18-year-olds are going to jobs. What jobs? What jobs were they going to do instead of going to university? The labour market is in a right old state. They were always going to go to university. They were always going to apply to university. They were always going to come. And I'm very surprised that universities spent very long worrying about deferral, because many of these young people did not have other options. Right, graduates only work for big business. Hello, small, but actually, this is an interesting one for me, because as of May, I work for a large employer as opposed to a small one, because Prospects merged with Jisc. So I went from working for a business of around 80 employees to one working for 800. So I'm part of a huge behemoth, but I'm still an SME person at heart. SMEs are a great place to start your career, and each year between 30 to 40% of graduates do start their careers. Obviously, the big organisations do dominate a lot of discussion. The Institute of Student Employers, who are very, very good and do an excellent job of representing their members, but nevertheless do largely represent large training schemes or large organisations, do have a disproportionate voice in this debate. And organisations like Grad Consult and smaller organisations and grad employers have a great deal to offer to this debate. So each year, between 30 to 40% of graduates go to work for companies with fewer than 250 employees. SMEs are especially important in large parts of the creative, architecture, construction, law, web design, sport and fitness, marketing, PR and advertising. SME employment is stronger in London and the larger cities, but the proportion of graduates entering SMEs was falling pre-pandemic because of competition, particularly because a lot of these sectors that SMEs are strong in are also sectors that struggle to recruit enough graduates. Now, COVID-19 has dropped a rather large spanner in the works of a lot of SMEs, who have generally tended to have a harder time of it than larger businesses, simply due to having lower cash reserves in many cases, and less, smaller client bases, less cash reserves, and so it's been very, very hard for smaller businesses. They remain the backbone of graduate employment, and particularly the backbone of graduate employment outside the larger cities. Absolutely vital that we all work together to ensure that the SME sector gets back on its feet. Absolutely vital that universities and graduates work together to help SMEs get back to where they should be. And SMEs are a hugely important engine of entrepreneurship, innovation, new thought, new ideas. Absolutely vital to the graduate, to the labour market in general, and the graduate labour market in particular. And we must not lose sight of their importance to graduate employment. In terms of the next question, this is the subject question. So you often hear about particularly the arts. So you can't, if you get a job in the arts, you won't get a job. Or if you get a degree in the arts, you won't get a job, because there aren't any jobs in the arts, and these qualifications are no use to you. And similarly, people worry that if they don't study a vocational subject, they won't get a job. When I talk to young people, particularly prospective university students, I hear the converse of that quite a bit. There are a lot of young people who are reluctant to study engineering and similar STEM subjects for fear that they may have to do that for a career. What if they don't like it? What if they take an engineering degree? Will they then have to be engineers anyway? No, is the honest answer. Oops, I've gone the wrong way. The UK is unusual. It has a particularly flexible graduate skills market, particularly flexible jobs market for graduates. And the majority of jobs, the opinions are divided on quite how many, what proportion it is. I would say probably somewhere between around 60%. The Institute of Student Employers, for example, the big businesses say 70 to 80% of their large training schemes are relatively subject blind. You can get any of them with any subject from fine art to physics. There's a slight bias towards business studies subjects, but that's mostly because the recruiters themselves tend to have businessy backgrounds and like to recruit in their own image. If you think of the graduate labour, the analogy that I've taken to using is, if you think of the graduate labour market as a big room, getting your degree allows you entrance. So people seem to think of the graduate labour market as a set of discrete boxes. And so if you take an engineering degree, for example, you can get into the engineering box. And the engineering box is big and it's got loads of cool jobs in that are in demand. Whereas if you get the art, you go into the art hall, doesn't pay very well. But it doesn't really work like that. The graduate labour market is more like a very large, it's more it lets you into the big conference hall with a huge range of jobs in. Now, if you get an engineering degree, you then also get access to a room leading off that big conference hall, a big breakout session that's full of engineering jobs. The market full of awful roles that are exciting and cutting edge and have decent pay and job security are in demand. If that's not for you, you've done project management, team working, will take those roles. And equally, if you've got an arts degree, yes, there's another and your ability to understand complicated textual information and explain it easily to people and all of this kind of thing. And our degrees are designed for that kind of jobs market, a wide range of skills as well as subject knowledges, and employers understand that, and that's how that works.
Okay, Charlie, I'm here as promised to let you know we've got 3 minutes left. So just 3 minutes for our wonderful last myth. And also just to let you know, you are freezing just a little bit from time to time. So we've had a couple of questions from people to say, will they get a copy of the slides? Yes, absolutely. We can provide that. Over to you for our grand finale.
I've got a whole extra presentation full of outtakes that I would have put in here if I'd have had longer, and they can have all of that as well.
Brilliant.
So right, the final myth, and this is one that you hear an awful lot. This is the nostalgist myth. They compare the current graduate labour market, which can be quite difficult for graduates, although certainly up until 2019 it was pretty good, with some mythical. There were jobs everywhere now, and as we can see, here is a group thing, this myth that are not exactly true. So graduates used to be able to walk into a job. It's based on a very, very rosy view of historic graduate employment. The debate about the employability of graduates, particularly in the arts, is one of the oldest in HE. Arguably, this is the debate that caused the split of Cambridge University from Oxford University back in the 12th century, when a lot of students rioted because they were struggling to find appropriate employment, and their lecturers basically barricaded themselves in their houses in Oxford to get away from what they called their lazy students who weren't willing to study. And the debate in higher education hasn't moved on in the last 800 years. It's still the same. Before World War II, there was very little work for arts graduates other than teaching. A lot of contemporary documentation showing how very few arts graduates got jobs. In 1935, for example, it's on record that only one arts graduate from Birmingham got a job outside teaching. And that was as a railway clerk. So this is a very, very old debate. This is not new. And in fact, in many ways, the job market for arts graduates is the best it's ever been. Even in the 60s and 70s, which is when people are often harken back to, we had plenty of unemployed and underemployed graduates, but the sense of what was appropriate was different. So, for example, I've got books, and I'm going to brandish one here. So this is, there you go, first destinations of degree graduates. Oh, it's mirrored, bother. That's graduate destinations from 1965. It was considered, it was so appropriate. There's a specialist section for women graduates going on to secretarial college, because that was considered an appropriate job for female graduates in the 60s. It was okay for you to get a degree and then train to be a secretary in the 60s. That was fine. That's what people say when they say, let's go back to that kind of jobs market. the 80s were amongst the, so if we think back to the last recession when things started to get very difficult, in actual fact for graduates, that jobs market was the worst it got, only reached the top 10 really difficult jobs markets. The 80s was actually the worst time on record to graduate. And 1982 was the worst year ever to graduate. And the early 90s was nearly as bad. I graduated in 1991, which is the third worst year to graduate on record. 1992 was the second worst year to graduate, and most of the 80s was significantly worse than any time that most of us in the under 50 have experienced as far as the graduate labour market is concerned. This idea that this is some kind of Shangri-La of graduate employment when graduates could just get a job, get a degree and just walk into a job, it never existed, ever, never happened.
And on that bombshell, Charlie,
Yeah,
and on that bombshell, may I, as always, thank you for your humour, your brilliant statistics, and for your insight to the market. Dr. Charlie Ball, everybody, the statistician magician himself, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
We will be circulating the details. As you saw, all of Charlie's information was on there. I'm sure he'll be able to help you, particularly in his new role at Jisc. I'm delighted.